So, good morning everybody. Today we're going to talk about an amazing hidden gem that was discovered in the John Johnson archive. It's John Johnson album 166 and it was found by Colin Harris, our Rare Books volunteer.
Who is here?
Who is here. So tell us how you found it, Colin.
Yes, well, I've been aware of it for many years when I first started surveying photographs for my own personal interest. Since the 1990s, I reckon I've been aware of it. Quickly, and I don't take your time, the John Johnson collection came to the Bodleian in 1968, and there was never really a staff to catalogue it properly. Photographic albums were listed by a UCLA student in very brief terms, and this volume album in question was just described as photographs from the Great War. Well, that doesn't tell you anything, doesn't tell you the size and whatever. Anyway, so in my retirement, one of my projects was to go through all the photographic albums in the John Johnson collection, this being one. And I duly listed them, thought how interesting they are, and then immediately contacted Andy because I knew he'd be interested. And his talk will now follow.
Colin, well, I am more than interested. It's very fascinating sort of moment in time that's been captured by this Wheale album of what are essentially amateur photographs taken. They're almost selfies. I've got photographs like this of my own from the late 1980s when I was a student. They've got a similar atmosphere. It's just young men, very young men, at war in the summer of 1916. It tells a story of number 70 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps, really between April and July, August 1916. And all sorts of interesting things can be extracted from the pictures and what's going on and the personalities. And I've researched two of the pilots that Colin carefully removed the photographs and annotated the notes that were written on the back of the photographs. And from those notes, I've researched two of the pilots, which I'm going to tell you about in the main today. But this is a Wheale photography album, and there's a string album which was in the back of the album with a postcard of a rather splendid car parked outside what looks like a London palace or garden. And I wonder if that's a post-war picture, possibly of the owner of the album originally. And Colin and I have been through it, and we believe that the album may have belonged to this gentleman here, Lieutenant Henry Francis Mace. And this is a great photograph. It's the first photograph sort of an individual in the album, so we think it belongs to him. And he's stood there in his uniform in front of a plane. And interestingly, when I blew the photographs up, which are very small, I blew them up to A3 colour, he's actually standing in front of a parked aircraft with a cigarette in his hand. And that's kind of the tone of the whole album. It's fascinating. So essentially, if I take you this way, this is the official history of the war in the air for World War I. And there's a tremendous amount of information about 70 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps. This was the plane they flew at that time. This is a 1.5 Sopwith Strutter, which was cutting-edge military technology in April 1916. It flew at 100 miles an hour, slightly more than Russell Brand on the M4, and it was capable of a height of 6,500 feet, and it could carry 130 pounds bomb load, which was a lot. And it was armed with a Vickers machine gun firing forward through the propeller, which was a new development, synchronised, with a Lewis gun firing back. And it was a two-seater plane. Then we move on to this. This is just a book about the fighter squadrons of the RAF. And interestingly, one of the most interesting photographs from the album is this, which from Colin's annotation says, Royal Visit, 29th of April 16, Farnborough. Now, I actually think rather than April, it's actually this. It's the 29th of June 1916, when King George V and Queen Mary visited the squadron at Jersey Brow at Farnborough, where the squadron had formed, and it was flying out in flights to its base, which is in a place called Fiennes-Villiers in France. All the armed forces were building up towards the big push at the Battle of the Somme. But again, this is interesting. The photograph in the book is obviously an official photograph, and you can see the sheds where the planes were parked. And there's a lot of sort of excitement in the crowd of young officers and men waiting for the King and Queen to arrive. And then Mace has taken this cheeky photograph as they're standing chatting to the senior officers, and there's a lady in waiting there, obviously admiring the new technology. And then if we move round, well, actually, we'll come back to those pictures. So this was a special squadron. For the Battle of the Somme, it was charged with long-range reconnaissance, and it was attached to Haig's general headquarters. And the plane it was equipped with was essentially like sort of an intruder fighter bomber. And if you go through the official history, it did a tremendous amount of operations. It's constantly referred to. It's got lots of references in the index. Possibly its finest hour was when it was able to count 40 trains of German reinforcements coming up behind the German front line to resist the Somme offensive, which was going on obviously at the time. And as we move on, there's more photographs which you can have a look at. This is a fascinating photograph, which is the one that I put in the email invitation, which is a plane of A flight over the lines. That's one of their aircraft turned over. Hopefully the crew walked away from that one. And then you can see a photograph that we think Mace took, which obviously corresponds with a picture in the book. And then it's worth bearing in mind, Stuart from Maps kindly supplied these. And this is the Fromelles area of the Somme front. And if you look at all these maps, most of the detail, particularly the red, which is the trench lines, was furnished by photographs taken by these squadrons. And now there are two pilots that I kind of researched. The first one was Mace. And all the pilots and crew that flew for the Royal Flying Corps were volunteers from the army. And he joined from the Norfolk Regiment. And again, there's interesting detail just from this photograph. He's wearing an army uniform with his wings attached, because obviously he's passed the pilot training. And then moving around, the other pilot that I researched was this gentleman, who is Henry Rathbone Heli Shaw. And this guy was born in 1895. He'd just been accepted by Clare College, Cambridge, just as the war broke, but he immediately volunteered. And I think that's the guy in that photograph there, which is kind of the most extraordinary picture, which is very rare. Photographs taken by other crew during World War I. And I actually think that might actually have been a moment when Mace and Heli Shaw flew together in March 1916, which was a flight from Farnborough to St Omer, which ended up in an RAF communique because the weather was so bad that it was a notable flight, and the fact they landed at St Omer. But if you look at that picture, I mean, I don't know whether he's about to utter an expletive to the person taking the picture because they're not concentrating on the Great War, or there's actually a whiteout weather-wise in front of them. And then moving around, there's all sorts of photographs. There's a great photograph there of mechanics moving a plane who look like they've been taken by surprise by Mace taking the photograph. All sorts of photographs. So what actually happened to these guys? Well, unfortunately, Heli Shaw was killed. And he was killed on the 19th of July, which is the start of the second phase of the Battle of the Somme at Fromelles, which Stuart kindly found me the maps for. He's only 21 years old. Mace was also shot down at the end of August, and I kind of rummaged around a bit and I found some records, and he appears in a photograph. That's the winter of 1916-1917 at Osnabrück Castle, because he'd been captured by the Germans, and there he is. It looks like he shaved his moustache off, but there he is. The interesting thing about this picture, it's an Imperial War Museum picture, and originally the strange ghostly shape in the middle was the German commandant for the camp, but whoever handed this picture to the Imperial War Museum had scratched him out. So that's the story of these two pilots, and Mace, we think, survived the war. As he was captured, he probably almost certainly did survive the war, because it stopped him being involved in the dreadful battles of 1917 and 18 that were ferocious in the air. So just to finish the talk, really, I spoke to Lydia Healy, our new photography curator, who's very interested in these pictures. She thinks these are actually directly taken. They're actually developed directly from the negative reel. They're printed straight onto paper. There's no silver in. And if you look at the borders of the pictures, it looks like they are segmented as negatives. She did a bit of further work, and she thinks she's identified the camera that might have been used to take these pictures. And it is a 1912 Kodak Vest camera, which was actually nicknamed the soldier's camera, and it was bought by sort of young men who would have joined the Royal Flying Corps. And the great moment for this particular model of camera was the 1924 Mallory expedition to Everest. You may have heard of that, and they're not sure whether he got to the top or not. So that's the camera that Lydia thinks was used to take these pictures. So that's the story of two pilots. It's the story of 70 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. They were a very notable squadron, and what's most extraordinary about them is they fought all the way through the Great War. Frequently, they'd approach a German air base, bomb it, and then hang around for the Germans to take off, so they could fight them in air-to-air combat. The squadron contained no less than 19 aces during the Great War, which were pilots that shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft, and they actually accounted for 297 German planes, just that one squadron during the war. So it might make you wonder what happened to 70 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. Well, they were disbanded in 1921. They were disbanded at the end of the Great War, but they were reformed in 1921 as a bomber squadron, and they fought through World War II with Wellington bombers, and they actually still exist today. And guess where they're based? They're actually based at Bryce Norton, and they fly the Airbus Atlas 400 giant transport plane, which you'll often see majestically circling around. And I found this picture as a final shot. That's December 2024, and that's a member of the RAF carrying out a high altitude jump from one of those aircraft somewhere over Oxfordshire. So you can perhaps imagine how cold that was. And that's it, that's my talk.